What's up, my fellow Shield Brothers? It's the Shield Brother back with part 3 of the History Armada's new series, The History of the Germanic States. Today with part 3, we're going to be talking about the early modern period for the Germanic States and what involved them and what this era kind of entailed for the developing Germanic States. So, with that, we're going to pick up right where we were last time, 1640-ish. And you can see here the HRE with its different dukedoms, princedoms, and its just central powers. Its different unique powers and its developing powers. You can see all the different ones in this map here. But as I promised, we're going to talk about, at the beginning of this, the Old Swiss Confederacy. The Swiss Confederacy that existed from about 1291 to 1798 in the same time as the Holy Roman Empire. And what its interactions kind of were. So, the Old Swiss Confederacy was a loose confederation of independent small states, or cantons, within the Holy Roman Empire itself. It is the precursor of the modern state of Switzerland. It formed during the 14th century from a nucleus in what is now called known as Central Switzerland, expanding to include the cities of Zurich and Bern by the middle of the century. This formed a rare union of rural and urban communes, all of which enjoyed imperial immediacy in the Holy Roman Empire. This confederation of 8 cantons was politically and militarily successful for more than a century, culminating in the Burgundy Wars of the 1470s, which established it as a power in the complicated political landscape dominated by France and the Habsburgs. Its success resulted in the addition of more confederates, increasing the number of cantons to 13 by 1513. The Confederacy pledged neutrality in 1647 under the threat of the 30 Years' War that was going on, as we talked in the last video. Although many Swiss served privately as mercenaries in the Italian Wars and during the early modern period. After the Swabian War of 1499, the Swiss Confederacy was a de facto independent state through the early modern period, which is the period we're talking about, although still nominally part of the Holy Roman Empire until 1648, when the Treaty of Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War. The Swiss Reformation divided the Confederates into Reformed and Catholic parties, resulting in internal conflict from the 16th to the 18th century within the Swiss Confederacy. As a result, the Federal Diet was often paralyzed by hostility between the two factions. The Swiss Confederacy fell to an invasion by the French Revolutionary Army in 1798, after which became the short-lived Helvetic Republic. So the nucleus of the Old Swiss Confederacy was an alliance among the valley communities of the Central Alps to facilitate management of common interests such as trade and ensure peace along trade routes through the mountains. The foundation of the Swiss Confederacy is marked by the Rüttelsver, dated to 1307, or in the 1315 Pact of Brunnen. Since 1889, the Federal Charter of 1291 among the rural communities had been considered the founding document of the Swiss Confederacy. So, just remember, Federal Charter 1291, roughly the start of the Swiss Confederacy. And that brings us to Swiss expansion. So the initial pact was augmented by pacts with the cities of Lucerne, Zurich, and Bern. This union of rural and urban communes, which enjoyed the status of imperial immediacy within the Holy Roman Empire, as I stated before, was engendered by pressure from Habsburg dukes and kings who had ruled much of the land before. In several battles with Habsburg armies, the Swiss were victorious and vicious. They conquered the rural areas of Glarus and Zug, which became members of the Swiss Confederacy. From 1353 to 1481, the federation of 8 cantons, known in German as Achtort, or 8 cantons, consolidated its position in the European field of politics. The members, especially the cities, enlarged their territory at the expense of local counts, primarily by buying judicial rights, but sometimes by force. So, as a whole, this Swiss Confederacy expanded through military conquest. The Arago was conquered in 1415 and the Thurgau in 1460. In both cases, the Swiss profited from weakness in the Habsburg dukes. In the south, Uri led a military territorial expansion that, after many setbacks, would by 1515 lead to the conquest of areas such as the Ticino. None of these territories became members of the Confederacy. They had the status of condominiums, regions administered by several cantons. At this time, the 8 cantons gradually increased their influence onto the neighboring cities and regions through additional alliances, and individual cantons conquered pacts with areas such as Schaffhausen, Freiburg, and Appenzell, the Abbot, and the city of St. Gallen, Biel, Rottweil, Mulhouse, and many other areas by just single pacts and alliances alone. These allies became closely associated with the Swiss Confederacy, but were not accepted as full members of the Swiss Confederacy. So they had a lot of de jure members and kind of counts and bishoprics that they could count on to help the Swiss Confederacy in times of need. The Burgundy Wars prompted a further enlargement of the Swiss Confederacy. Freiburg and the Solothurn were accepted in 1481. In the Swabian Wars against Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, the Swiss were victorious and exempted from imperial legislation. So they earned the right to be exempt from imperial legislation through bloody warfare and quite an astounding victory against the Holy Roman Emperor. So the associated cities of Basel and Schaffhausen joined the Confederacy as a result of that conflict, and Appenzell followed suit in 1513 as the 13th member. The Federation of 13 cantons constituted the Old Swiss Confederacy until its demise in 1798. The expansion of the Old Swiss Confederacy was stopped by the Swiss defeat in 1515 at the Battle of Morignano. Only Bernay and Freiburg were still able to conquer the Vaud in 1536. That later primarily became part of the canton of Bern, with a small portion under the jurisdiction of Freiburg. But you can see how the Swiss were kind of the underdog here, but were able to earn their own rights and exemption from imperial legislation by warfare against the Holy Roman Emperor, which was unheard of at the time, as well as kind of carve its own dignity and its own identity into its controlled areas, and its different cantons expanded. So, from the Swiss, we're going to talk about the Reformation, especially within the Holy Roman Empire. In the early 16th century, there was a discontent by abuses such as the indulgences in the Catholic Church, and a general desire for reform could be heard across the European political and religious landscape. In 1517, the Reformation began with the publication of Martin Luther's 95 Theses. You can see Martin Luther on your right of the screen there. He posted them in the town square and gave copies of them to German nobles. But it's debated whether he nailed them to the church door in Wittenberg, as it's commonly said he did. Well, the list detailed 95 assertions Luther believed to show corruption and misguidance within the Catholic Church. One often cited example, through perhaps not Luther's chief concern, is a condemnation of the selling of indulgences. Another prominent point within the 95 Theses is Luther's disagreement both with the way in which the higher clergy, especially the Pope, used and abused their powers, and with the very idea of the Pope, because he did not believe that the Church truly needed a figurehead of the Pope, or was it thoroughly stated in the biblical writings that there was a need for the Pope. In 1521, Luther was outlawed at the Diet of Worms. But the Reformation spread rapidly, helped by the Emperor Charles V war against the French and the Turks. Hiding in the Wartburg Castle, Luther translated the Bible from Latin to German, establishing the basis of the German language. A curious fact is that Luther spoke a dialect which had minor importance in the German language at the time. After the publication of his Bible, his dialect suppressed the others and evolved into what is now modern German. So he helped shape what the language of German would be like by his publications and his translation of the Bible. In 1524, the German Peasants' War broke out in Swabia, Franconia, and Thuringia against ruling princes and lords, following the preaching of reformers. But the revolts were assisted by war-experienced noblemen like Gotz von Berchtesgaden and Florian Geyer, and by the theologian Thomas Munzer, but they were soon repressed by the territorial princes. As many as 100,000 German peasants were massacred during this revolt. With the protestation of the Lutheran princes at the Imperial Diet of Speyer and the rejection of the Lutheran Augsburg Confession at Augsburg in 1530, a separate Lutheran church emerged from this. From 1545, the Counter-Reformation began in Germany. The main force was provided by the Jesuit order founded by the Spaniard Ignatius of Loyola. Central and northeastern Germany were by this time almost wholly Protestant, and whereas western and southern Germany remained predominantly Catholic. In 1547, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V defeated the Schmalkaldic League, an alliance of Protestant rulers. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 brought recognition of the Lutheran faith into the Holy Roman Empire. But the treaty also stipulated that the religion of a state was to be bound by that of its ruler. And that meant that the ruler of the different Germanic states dictated what the religion of the state was to be. Would it be Protestantism, Lutheranism, or would it be Catholicism? Different shades of that. And it depended on the ruler. And in 1608 and 1609, the Protestant Union and the Catholic League were formed, kind of to rival each other and make sure that neither one got more sway than the other. So that brings us to the 30 Years' War. So from 1618 to 1648, the 30 Years' War raged in the Holy Roman Empire. Its causes were the conflicts between Catholics and Protestants, the efforts by the various states within the empire to increase their power, and the Catholic emperor's attempt to achieve the religious and political unity of the empire. The immediate occasion for the war was the uprising of the Protestant nobility of Bohemia against the emperor. But the conflict was widened into a European war by the intervention of King Christian IV of Denmark, Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, and the French under Cardinal Richelieu. Germany became the main theater of war for the 30 Years' War, and the scene of the final conflict between France and the Habsburgs for predominance on Europe. The fighting often was out of control, with marauding bands of hundreds or thousands of starving soldiers and peasants spreading plague, plundering, and murdering just across the German states' countrysides. The armies that were under control moved back and forth across the countrysides year after year, levying heavy taxes on cities and countrysides, and seizing the animals and food stocks of the peasants without payment. The enormous social disruption over the 3 decades caused a dramatic decline in the population because of killings, disease, crop failures, declining birth rates from a lack of males, and random destruction caused by the marauders, and outmigration of terrified people fleeing to different Germanic states from the ones that were being, placed in the middle of this giant war. So one estimate shows a 38% drop from 16 million people in 1618 to 10 million people in 1650, while another shows only a 20% drop of population from 20 million to 16 million. The Altmark and the Württemberger regions were especially hard hit. It took generations for Germany and its Germanic states to fully recover from the devastation of the 30 Years' War. The war ended in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. Alsace was permanently lost to France, Pomerania was temporarily lost to Sweden, and the Netherlands officially left the Holy Roman Empire. Imperial power declined further as the states' rights were increased. This should be remembered for our further videos. So now we'll talk about the culture, the literacy, and the science of the early modern era in the Germanic states and the Holy Roman Empire. So the German population reached about 20 million people, the great majority of whom were peasant farmers. The Reformation was a triumph of literacy and the new printing press used in these northern states. Luther's translation of the Bible into German was a decisive moment in the spread of literacy, and stimulated as well as the printing and distribution of religious books and pamphlets. From 1517 onward, religious pamphlets flooded Germany and much of Europe. By 1530, over 10,000 publications are known with a total of 10 million peoples and copies. The Reformation was thus a media revolution, as if you were. So Luther strengthened his attacks on Rome by depicting a good against bad churches. From there, it became clear that print could be used for propaganda in the Reformation for particular agendas and causes. Reform writers used pre-Reformation styles, cliches, and stereotypes, and changed items as needed for their own purposes. So you can see how slander and propaganda came from the printing press revolution of the Northern Renaissance. And especially it was effective where Luther's small catechism for use of parents teaching their children and larger catechism for pastors. Using the German vernacular, they expressed the Apostles' Creed in simpler, more personal Trinitarian language. Illustrations in the newly translated Bible and in many texts popularized Luther's ideas. Lucas Cranach the Elder, which is shown there, the great painter patronized by the electors of Wittenberg, was a close friend of Luther, and illustrated Luther's theology for a popular audience. He dramatized Luther's views on a relationship between the Old and New Testament, while remaining mindful of Luther's careful distinctions about proper and improper uses of visual imagery. And Luther's German translation of the Bible was also decisive for the German language, as I stated earlier, how it would, in its evolution from early New High German to modern standard. His Bible promoted the development of non-local forms of language and exposed all speakers to forms of German from outside their own area and their own dialects. It showed them a more unified German language, if you were, but not quite unified yet. Just kind of got that started. And as far as science, decisive scientific developments took place during the 16th and 17th century, especially in the fields of astronomy, mathematics, and physics. The German astronomical community played a dominant role in Europe at this early modern period, as its scientists kept in close touch with one another and were able to share and spread their ideas. Several non-German scientists influenced this community of German scientists, like astronomers Copernicus, who worked in Poland, and Tycho Brahe, who worked in Denmark and Bohemia. Copernicus, for example, was better known inside the German community than outside. Astronomer Johannes Kepler from Wilhelmstadt, as one of the leaders in the 17th century scientific revolution within the Germanic States. He is best known for his laws of planetary motion. His ideas influenced contemporary Italian scientist Galileo Galilei, and provided one of the foundations for Englishman Isaac Newton's theory of universal gravitation. That is, again, Johannes Kepler, who, during the early modern period of the Germanic States, brought these new ideas. So, thank you, and next week we're going to cover the ages of 1648 to 1850 and how the Germanic States further revolutionized themselves and expanded and evolved. And tune in next week for that next episode. This has been the Shield Brother for the History Armada with another episode of the history of the Germanic States. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll catch y'all next time.